It took me approximately 45 years to finally get around to building a garden railway, and it's taken about 16 years for it to reach its present state. I do hope you enjoy this brief history of the making of the Peckforton Light Railway as much as I've enjoyed constructing it. A lot of time, well over a year, was spent in plotting different ways in which I might be able to fit a railway into the garden, but eventually I decided on a plan which I felt would make the best of the available space. Construction of the railway started in 2004, and by the spring of 2005 most of the landscaping had been done, and in the summer track laying began. It was in December that the first train ran, my LGB starter set loco and coaches, and one single solitary bogie coach. Through 2006 I began the process of constructing or modifying goods wagons to resemble the sort of stock which might be found on a UK-based narrow gauge railway. At that time, apart from a few kits, there was hardly anything available commercially to run on 45mm gauge track, and so I needed to make my own, and besides it was cheaper. In the summer we had an official opening ceremony, with a train running around in the background. During 2007 the track was ballasted, and a few more wagons were bashed or built from scratch. The most significant development was the construction of my first UK-style locomotive, a garden railway specialist kit on an LGB motor block. Although I only had a few items of rolling stock, I was already planning how freight would be managed, and so created an interactive database to generate freight manifests. In 2008, another loco and a couple of coaches were acquired, which one day I intended to bash into something more appropriate for the UK. But probably the most significant event in 2008 was the conception and birth of the Peckforton Light Railway. Until then the two existing stations had had no names, but after a walk in the Peckforton Hills near where I lived, I felt it was the ideal setting for a narrow gauge railway. An extension was constructed down the side of the garden for the copper mine at Bickerton, and the main station at Beeston Market. Beeston Castle Station was then added in one corner, together with a mound on which would sit Beeston Castle. And then, much later in the year, Peckforton Station was added, the track being fixed in place on a very frosty Boxing Day morning. To meet the ever-increasing demands of my freight handling programme, a few more wagons needed to be constructed. A rake of open wagons, made from my own resin castings, a couple of scratch-built cattle wagons, based loosely on those on the Welshbourne-Llanfair Railway. A collection of hopper wagons was slowly accumulating to handle the traffic from the copper mine, and I'd also acquired quite a few closed vans, some of which were still awaiting anglicisation. Station buildings were added to all the stations, using resin cast kits from T&M models. A swing bridge, based on the one across the River Blythe on the Southwold Railway, was constructed from UPVC angle and screwed to the plank which took the railway across the front of the sheds. A new link from just outside Buckley Station was built to represent the branch leading to the copper mine. As you can see from this track diagram, this enabled trains to take the loop through to Buckley, then back along behind the sheds and down to Peckforton Station, over to Beeston Castle, and then back for a third time round the sheds to Beeston Market. The garden was maturing quite nicely, and as a friend commented at the time, what you've got here is more of a garden with a railway than vice versa. 2010, and at last passengers on the railway had some decent accommodation. A rake of 3 coaches constructed from Madison wooden coach kits. Another garden railway specialist kit-built loco had joined the fleet, an 040 Hunslet. By now a livery had been decided upon. Brunswick green for locos, grey for good stock and maroon for coaches. An LGB diesel loco was giving good service handling the copper mine traffic, though its days as a bright orange toy train were numbered, as were the bright red hoppers. To find room for the ever-expanding range of goods rolling stock, more sidings were added to Beeston Market Station. A concrete overbridge was cast in situ across the copper mine branch, plus another across the main line. And here and there details were being added to stations, such as this fencing behind the platform at Peckforton. The railway was now taking shape, and running sessions were becoming increasingly enjoyable, as goods services and copper ore traffic fitted in around the timetabled passenger trains. Probably the most important development in 2011 was the construction of my first scratch-built loco body, a Fowler diesel loco, basically a couple of plastic hard boxes mounted on the chassis of that bright orange toy train diesel loco. Those bright red hopper wagons also received a bit of a makeover, or maybe it should be a make-under. A Garden Railway Specialist kit-built Barclay loco, which I had bought towards the end of 2010, was reliveried and entered service on passenger, mixed and goods services. A few more wagons were given the Peckforton Light Railway treatment, which meant that goods traffic was now becoming quite extensive and providing me with a lot of shunting to carry out at each of the 5 stations. An engine shed was squeezed onto a couple of the sidings at Beeston Market, constructed from plywood and clad in a couple of 100 coffee stirrers. A personal milestone was reached in 2011 with a significant birthday. To mark the occasion, I took a flight aboard a microlight aircraft and persuaded the pilot to fly over the route of my railway. I bashed a couple of resin coaches into a sort of double-ended Ford rail motor, but it was a poor performer with a feeble motor and what turned out to be a fragile gearbox. But it was the first battery-powered vehicle on the Peckforton Light Railway. Towards the end of the year, dark rumblings were afoot. Becoming increasingly frustrated with the performance of track-powered locos when trying to run slowly or carry out shunting operations, I started to investigate controlling my locos by radio control, but as cheaply as possible. By 2012 I had settled into a relaxed pattern of operating the railway. Passenger and goods services were being honed to perfection, and the infrastructure of the railway was steadily developing. A new garage left Beeston Market Station somewhat isolated, but its cramped layout was severely affecting freight operations. Something needed to be done. Meanwhile, the biggest development was the provision of a backdrop of buildings at the copper mine. A crusher shed, offices, workshop, and a loading hopper were constructed, giving a purposeful and industrious feel to the sidings. 22 signals were constructed for deployment around the layout, following advice from a fellow modeller and signalman who had come to visit the railway. A few more wagons were added to the fleet, including this crane wagon, scratch-built on a Heartland Loco Works mini-series chassis, which formed the basis for many of my wagons. The rail motors were painted, but although I fitted another motor and gearbox, it was disappointingly underpowered. This station stop was simply because it didn't have enough puff to climb the gradient at Peckforton Station. Although I was fulfilling my ambitions of running a railway as realistically as possible, I was becoming increasingly frustrated with track power. No matter how meticulously I cleaned the track, locos would stutter and stall at regular intervals. And so I continued my experiments with cheap forms of radio control. This transmitter, designed for use with cheap helicopters, was bought for £10 and seemed to do the job. So the stage was being set for a revolution in the way Peckforton Light Railway was going to be operated. See Part 2 for the next thrilling instalment.